You know, I'm getting real tired of having to have this debate, but apparently it's a debate that must be had when we see every single day game journalists taking their ideologies, their politics, and shoving it and shoehorning it into the gaming space, doing their absolute best to change the culture and the landscape as we know it. So welcome back to Words of Paradise. I'm your host, Leon Idle, and you heard it here first. I'll be the first to tell you that Resident Evil 5 is not racist. It never was racist, it never will be racist, but that doesn't stop IGN from talking about the game like it's freaking Voldemort or something. So hit that subscribe button. I'm a nerdy news channel. I cover nerdy news almost every day, and now they're talking about this game, the Resident Evil game that can't be remade. So hit the subscribe button while we go through this, and I break down why this is an absurd article, especially in the wake of all the Sweet Baby Inc. stuff, where they absolutely claim we are not a sort of company that tries to shove modern politics and ideologies in gaming. Then explain why the people that have been your most ardent defenders, like IGN, explain why they would write something like this. And the worst part about this article is it starts off relatively fine. Actually, for an IGN article, it's not awful. The first few paragraphs are them actively talking about the game, its history, what it did for Resident Evil 5, why people were upset with it in terms of it being kind of a poor Resident Evil game. I love Resident Evil 5, I'll also be the first to tell you it's not a very good Resident Evil game in terms of being a horror game, but it's great when it comes to the story, a story that again is unequivocally not racist. So let's go through this, see what they have to say. With Resident Evil 4's release last year, Capcom's project to remake the glory years of its survival horror series is complete, but as the game's post-credit scene suggests, the remakes aren't over, and so the big question is, what's next? The obvious answer is a remake of Resident Evil 5. Is that the obvious answer, though? Resident Evil 5 came out on PS3, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting real sick of these remakes of video games that literally are only a couple generations old that we really don't need remakes of. Sure, the Dead Space remake looked pretty, but it was literally just Dead Space. The original game holds up really well. We actually didn't need a remake. Resident Evil 5 is the exact same. It does not need a remake. People still play that game co-op for fun to this day. I know several of them that do. The servers are still active. I've found online co-op partners on the Switch, for example. People are still playing Resident Evil 5 on the Switch. So no, we don't need another remake. Frankly, we didn't need a remake of 4, but you guys know my thoughts on that already. On the game's 15th anniversary, it's clear that moving forward chronologically will take Capcom's remakes into the series' weakest era, an era of gameplay and narrative decisions best left in the past. Really? What narrative decisions were best left in the past? Because if we were to take Resident Evil 5 at its core and just stopped the series there, it actually had a great ending for the series. Now, granted, Sheva shouldn't have gotten the kill. It should have been Chris and Jill that took out Wesker, but you know what? That's a bit of a gripe that, I'd be open to seeing a change to. The point is, the game narratively was fine. It was all gameplay that people had issues with. Resident Evil 5 simply can't be remade, at least not to the standards of Capcom's best work. Well, tell us, what is their best work? Because Resident Evil 4 is a shallow shell of the former original game. Resident Evil 2 Remake is fine, but it's definitely not as good as the original. It's definitely the best of the bunch. And Resident Evil 3 is quite literally one of the worst video games I've ever played, remake or not. So tell me what the standards of Capcom's best work is when their 3 most recent remakes have all ranged from mediocre to acceptable to flat out trash. And so the answer is not to remake, but to rewrite. They want to rewrite history, rewrite the past, because that's what these gaming companies are all about. Not necessarily Capcom and Square Enix, but I'm talking about these game journalists that think that the best way to acknowledge the past is to not acknowledge it at all. In fact, completely rewrite it as if it didn't happen. Hey, these video games and these stories and these narratives that you've grown up on, that you've loved, that have been an integral part of the video game culture, and really at this point, video games are such a massive part of the culture that these stories are part of culture. Yeah, just go ahead and rewrite them because they're so problematic. But again, so far, they actually haven't said anything very ideologically driven, if you notice. They're just talking about the game itself. Resident Evil is a survival horror series. Not that you know that playing Resident Evil 5. Sure, it features a constant flow of horrific imagery, but RE5... Oh, horrific imagery? Are you saying all those black people are horrible to look at in the game? Shame on you, IGN. That is awful racist of you. RE5 is an action game through and through. That's evident in its cover shooting mechanics, vehicle chases with on-rails turret sequences. That happens like once. And the constant rattle of assault rifles. Even as visual design evokes the sandy shades of modern military games that experienced mass popularity in the late 2000s. No, I'm going to push back on this, because at the end of the day, what the game set out to do, well, you can argue whether it worked for this or not, but it tried to show you that, hey, you can have horror even in a daytime environment, like in Africa, like in the deserts. There can be horror done right without it having to be in the middle of a dark, stormy night. And you know what? Again, we can argue whether it succeeded in that, but it's a pretty unique idea when it comes to horror games. So I want to give it, props and credit there. It's not like it was just trying to be Call of Duty with a Resident Evil skin. We would get that in later Resident Evil games. It all speaks to the series that lost its way, rather than reflect on the tenets that were the foundation of its existence. Resident Evil 5 looked to the contemporary gaming zeitgeist in an attempt attempt to find a new lease on life. The result is an unholy hybrid of Resident Evil, Gears of War, and Call of Duty. It's as ugly and unwieldy as it sounds. Really? Because at the time it came out, it was the best-selling Resident Evil game of all time. In fact, I believe until it might still be the best-selling Resident Evil game of all time. I have to check on that, but I'm pretty sure Resident Evil 5 to this day is the single highest-selling Resident Evil game of all time. So if it's so bad, if it's so ugly, if it's so unwieldy, why is it so beloved by people in and out of the Resident Evil fandom? And then from here, it goes on to actually talk about the game designs. You know, the misreading of its predecessor, Resident Evil 4. Mikami never lost sight of the terror at the core of Resident Evil. Mikami being Shinji Mikami, the creator of Resident Evil, or at least the director going forward, but he left after Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 5, meanwhile, presents its enemies as waves to be gunned down with increasingly powerful weaponry. Their purpose is cannon fodder, a wall of meat to slow your progress through levels. Again, these are all valid criticisms. I mean, I would still argue against them. I think they're being very shallow and pedantic. I think they're actually masking their disdain for this game because of their political ideology with these criticisms, but you could argue these criticisms on the merit of themselves. However, it comes down to what they're talking about here, how their lack of authenticity means no one will ever mention the Kijuju Autonomous Zone in the same breath as the Spencer Mansion. Again, I would actually agree with that. People are going to talk about the two the same. You know, the Kijuju Autonomous Zone, yeah, not exactly as memorable as the Spencer Estate. However, this is after they give us a few paragraphs of legitimate game design criticism, something that we would have loved to hear from IGN 10 years ago. Here's where things start getting hairy. A faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror. Has it really been a 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror? Because Resident Evil 8 is a great game. It's a horrible Resident Evil game. The only good Resident Evil game they've given us in the last several years is Resident Evil 7. Again, Resident Evil 8's a fine game, horrible Resident Evil game. It's more like a Silent Hill game, if anything. But the point is, this is an absolute just retwisting of history. All this to say, the faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror games. It's telling the series' reset point. Resident Evil 7 was a reinvention of the very first game, a haunted house that grew even larger as you unlocked new rooms by solving puzzles. And yeah, they're going to go on to talk more and more until, of course, we get to this right here. Remakes can, of course, completely redefine their structure of their source material. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, is recognizably an updated version of the classic RPG. Is it though? Because a lot of people are having problems with it. But alright, let's, for sake of argument, say that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is, you know, a retelling or a recognizably updated version of the classic RPG. Then why do we need that? We don't actually. Resident Evil Final Fantasy 7 came out on the PS1. You could argue that a remake for that is justifiable. You can't make that argument for a PS3 game that, again, still holds up beautifully. But its a world design and gameplay mechanics are a world apart from the 1997 original. And so you can argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil most in need of a remake. Why? When Code Veronica's out there, but again, with how modern day trash Capcom has been, I wouldn't trust them with Code Veronica. A whole new environmental structure and scenario design that reins in the action and dials up the horror would bring it in line with Capcom's other remakes. Really? Would it bring it in line with Capcom's other remakes? Resident Evil 4, the remake, still wasn't scary, just like the original Resident Evil 4 wasn't particularly scary. But all of this doesn't account for Resident Evil 5's most notorious problem, racism. You got it. I will say, I'm proud of IGN for waiting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs and not even really bringing it up till the very end of the 6th. But from here on out, that's literally all it is. It is all them just throwing a fit about how absurdly racist Resident Evil 5 is, proving once again that they don't even understand Resident Evil 5. Like, they're gonna take this cherry-picked image right here, which, by the way, shows one of the white Majini, because it wasn't just black people in Resident Evil 5. It's not like you were just gunning down waves and waves of blacks only. Like, there was still quite a bit of diversity in terms of the enemy variety, which is kind of crazy considering it takes place in a fictionalized version of Africa. And even then, in 2009, they were like, oh, we probably can't have him murdering only black people. That's why you have Sheva, who's, you know, Chris's partner. That's why you have Josh Stone, two prominent black leads in the game that are pivotal to the story. Set in a fictional West African country, Resident Evil 5's primary antagonists are black people. No, the primary antagonist is Albert Wesker, a white guy. And then, you know, his partner in crime, Excella Gion, a black woman. It's interesting you don't talk about Excella, though. I mean, that's very, very diverse. I mean, you got a strong, independent black woman who's running her own company. She's a CEO, and you don't bring her up? Why? It doesn't help fit your narrative of just the white guy slaying all the black people? I mean, granted, you do kill her way later in the game. But she's a bad guy. You're not killing her because she's black. They're treating this game, they're treating Resident Evil 5 like it's got such an abject, horrible legacy. Like, all of a sudden, there was these individuals that lived in the woods, and I ain't never played one of them video games before, but I heard in this here Resident Evil 5, you can kill the darkies, so I'ma buy me a PlayStation Nintendo 4. Like, that wasn't happening, IGN. Yes, technically it's Ouroboros virus the protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting, but the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of mobs and primitives who are violent even before their infection. Well, have you been to certain parts of Africa? Have you looked at a National Geographic magazine? Look, I get it, there are certain cities that are very technologically advanced. Go ahead and look at Egypt, and look at not Gaza, Giza. Gaza's very different. Either way, go ahead and look at Giza. Look at the cities along the Nile. Yes, there are parts of Africa, there are parts of South Africa, brilliant, beautiful, bustling cities. But there are other parts of Africa where they still enslave people, and they're ran by mob rule, and men with guns, and basically it's guerrilla warfare all the time. And when you look at that portion of Africa, it makes sense in context that, hey, we would use these poor, struggling nations that have no foothold in the world to test our evil bioweapons, because, well, who's gonna care about them? They're the downtrodden victims of reality of living in Africa. It's not a problem to realistically depict Africa in a sci-fi survival horror video game. Intentionally or not, Resident Evil 5 positions Africa as the Dark Continent, an uncivilized world harboring a diseased population that needs gunning down via Western intervention in the name of global security. We're not even going to read any more of this, because when you read this sentence, you realize this is everything you need to know about what IGN stands for. They are completely, intentionally misrepresenting the game, misrepresenting what Resident Evil is, not bringing up any of the context because it doesn't fit the modern narrative. They are banking on a bunch of 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds reading this who have never actually played Resident Evil because they were like 2 when the game came out or something like that, and they're going to say, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get this young group of kids, these people that never actually played this game, to rally against it as if it's some tentpole of racism, when in all reality, it's just a fucking video game. It's a pretty decent video game at that. Say what you want about the AI Sheva and whatnot, but in general, when it comes to Resident Evil, it's far from one of Resident Evil's worst games. But that's what this is. Because this is a game that has a lot of enemies that are black because it takes place in Africa, it is the perfect breeding ground for this incestuous ideology that IGN, the Mary Sue, Polygon, all of their ilk absolutely spill. And you know what? I actually think this will happen. They're talking about how instead of remaking the game, they would need to rewrite it, do a completely new and original story, and basically wipe Resident Evil 5 from the map. That's what the article goes on to talk about. And with the fact that Capcom and so many other Japanese companies have taken ESG money, with the fact that we see Square Enix actually being involved with companies like Sweet Baby Inc., I wouldn't be surprised if the head honchos over at Capcom saw an article like this and thought, man, the West really, really wants a lot of progressivism in their game, so when we remake Resident Evil 5 or any other game going forward, we've got to absolutely add that progressivism. We already saw it with things in Resident Evil 4, like them, cutting out the joke about Ashley's boobs or whatever, and yeah, you can say, oh, it's so dumb to complain about little things like that. It always starts as little things, and then it escalates, and then it ramps up. It's the slippery slope if you haven't seen it before, but of course, we've all seen the slippery slope by this point, so when IGN makes these articles, and when the head honchos at Capcom or insert any other Japanese company here reads these articles and sees support for this sort of thing on X, they're going to think this is what gamers want, when it unequivocally is not what gamers want. In fact, this is what gamers are actively fighting against. That's why the Sweet Baby Inc. detective page has well over 250,000 followers at this point. That's why 2 weeks later, the story refuses to die. I got over 1,000 views on a video about it a couple days ago. I'm a small nothing YouTuber talking about a 2-week-old story, and even that video is still getting literally thousands of views. So yeah, I think most of the gamers, we've realized this is a story that's not going to die until we get our way. And what is our way? For these corporations, whether it be people like Sweet Baby Inc., whether it be these wannabe game journalists that don't actually care about video games and only look at them as an avenue to inject their identity politics, until they are roasted and thrown out the game, until we put them down the way Chris Redfield puts down the Majini in Resident Evil 5, yeah, gaming will not be going back to the way what it once was, to what we grew up with and what we loved, and it's all their fault. So we've at least finally got our avenue for just forging ahead and saying, you are the target, you are the enemy, and we are going to treat you as such. But those are just my opinions. Let me know yours in the comments down below, or let me know on X, where you can find me at BoltTheWord. And please do subscribe. I'm a nerdy news channel. I cover nerdy news every day. Not always about video games, even though there's been a lot of that lately, but anime, movies, music, Magic the Gathering, you name it. Check me out on Instagram at wordsofparadise_Leon. Become a member for $4.99 a month. You can join the Discord, choose the articles that I like to cover. It's a great time, and use discount code VITALIDOL to get 20% off your merch, whether it be a t-shirt or a mug. All in all, you guys know the drill. It's all here in the Nerdosphere, and this has been Words of Paradise.